Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today I want to talk a little bit about urbanization, and this is going to be a conversation that we will continue having. We'll be talking about how we use land, we'll be talking about connecting cities, we'll be talking about urban hierarchy, we'll be talking about urban decay, but today I just want to introduce the concept of how cities are different than their rural counterparts. So your first thing is going to be, though, your mini quiz question. So why are cities often much more polluted than the neighboring countryside? There are more factories in the cities. Cities tend to heat up more than the countryside, resulting in air inversions. Because of taller buildings, there tends to be less wind in cities than the countryside. There's generally a higher density of cars being driven in cities, or all of the above. The city is a completely different environment than the actual wild environment, obviously. But we want to talk about what kinds of things that results in because we change the geography, essentially, when we build a city. And all of these things will contribute to higher pollution in cities, all of these things. And we'll talk about each of them and as we go through our total city conversation. And the first thing that you can see, it's obvious that we're changing everything around it. I mean, we have little mountains, little hills that we've put in, and they're very close to each other, and there's lots of concrete and not lots of green space, as opposed to a couple of little hills, right? Just kind of spread out with this beautiful green space. So it's a completely different environment, and it's not just a completely different environment for us, it's a completely different environment for the other organisms that share these spaces with us. All right, so when we look at the city, it's crowded, it's big, all of these things. When we look at the rural spaces, for many people, there's a connection like, ooh, I want to be out in the country. Ooh, it's more relaxing. Ooh, it's nice. So why do we live in cities? There are push factors and there are pull factors. Push factors will move people away from where they are, and pull factors bring them back in or bring them into a space. So push factors, there are a bunch of them that will cause people to move out of rural areas into cities, and part of it has to do with income and resources, right? There are more resources available in cities, and there are more opportunities for income in cities. And those also become the pull factors. So you have not enough where you are, and you see a space that has what you need. So you're pushed out by lack sometimes, and sometimes it's really just a pull factor. It's like, oh, I'm comfortable here, but I want more, so I want to go there. So that's attractive to me, so I'm going to move to the city. And sometimes it's a combination of the push being bigger than the pull. So it really just depends. But whatever the reasons, urban populations are growing rapidly, and that gives us two things. One, we get mega cities, which we'll talk about later on, and we have so many people who are trying to rely on these resources that everybody was coming for, that you end up having cities, especially in developing countries, as centers of poverty. And so when we start looking at these major cities, we used to think of a mega city as being anything over 10 million, but there's so many cities now that are over 10 million, that they're not really mega cities anymore. And so the definition is still 10 million, but there are cities that are over 20 million. I mean, Tokyo's over 20 million. That's rare, but there are lots of cities over 10 million. One thing I want to point out as you're looking at this map at all these major cities, you will notice that all of them are on the coast, right? So one, that typically means that they're older, and two, it means that they have access to trade networks that interior cities don't have. So your first really big geographical sort of identification of what goes into making a big city is its location, and that location needs to be on water, and not just rivers, big water, right? So coasts. The real kind of exception to that is Mexico City. Most of the, but it's close. But most of the others are like right on the coast. Okay, so when we talk about urbanization in the U.S., right, 80% of Americans, just about 80% of Americans live in cities. And when you look at urban areas, you can look at this map right here. Also, I think the Earth at night maps really do the best to show where everybody lives. This is an Earth at night map, and you can clearly see the difference between developed nations. They're the ones that glow at night because they have all of the infrastructure to provide electricity to everybody. They're the ones that that have lots of big cities instead of these few huge cities. I mean, look at Africa. There's a few huge cities, and I get that the north is mostly desert, but still, right? This is all desert too. So there's that. So when we're looking at those differences, but also you can just see the sprawl of these cities. And it's very clear in the United States. Oh, look, there's us. We're this big, wide, bright spot. And yet our population is lower than some of these other bright spots. And part of that has to do with the way cities form. So building up versus building out. We in Dallas have the opportunity to build out, right? We can just continue to go. And frankly, if you drive down 75, it's really city all the way to Oklahoma. And so you're looking at basically 3 hours of city. So we have the city, we have Dallas and we have Fort Worth, and then we have edge cities in between them, like Arlington, right? Grand Prairie and places like that. And then we've got edge cities on the other side, and then we have edge cities that go up, and eventually they form this big metropolis. And so now we have DFW that's a huge, right, space that encompasses lots of cities. Plano, Duncanville, Richardson, Farmers Branch, Carrollton, right, all of these other places. So we can do that. But what if you're limited by either water, right? So there's a little nice river here. We're going to build up, or mountains, we're going to build up. Right? And so if you've got flat, big, wide spaces, you have a tendency to build out unless there's regulations not to. Okay, it's the difference between Denver and Colorado Springs. If you have limited boundaries, you still have to put people someplace, so you're going to go up. And then it's really about filling every space. People will find a place to live. They will find a place to build a shop. And so you sometimes get the sprawl and the building up, right? And so what do I mean when I talk about sprawl? I'm really talking about just cities moving out and keeping going. And so why does this happen? Well, it turns out that in these spaces where you have sprawl, in terms of sprawl, really does mean that you're moving away from city center. You get really dense cities that may go up and they get really crowded. But when we talk about sprawl, that's not sprawl, right? Because the city footprint stays about the same. Sprawl is where your city footprint is growing. And you can do this because land is available, because it's flat, and land is affordable. And so urban areas will sprawl because of this cheapness. And in part, some of it comes from things like federal government loans for people to buy houses, but they need to be cheap houses out away from the city. Also the low cost of gasoline, right? And the fact that governments pay for highways. Cities don't pay for highways, governments do that. And so with relatively cheap gasoline and free highways, even when you have tollways, they're not that expensive in sprawl areas, and so people will drive, right? And there are tax breaks to own homes, and lots of people want to own homes. They want to have their own space. They don't want to share a space with someone else. And so you have this combination of the desire to own a home and the ability to own a home because of cheap, affordable land, because of government programs, and because of tax laws, right? And interestingly enough, in these urban sprawl areas, a lot of times what you have is residential zones and commercial zones. And so you're not having mixed use stuff. And frankly, lots of urban areas really just didn't think they were going to get as big as they did, and so they didn't plan it out. And so you can see in cities, the planned parts of cities, they're usually well organized, everything's going well, the streets are little grids, and then you get to the part where it's like, oh, we're just going to add on here. And so the heart of the city, the downtown, depending, if it's Dallas, then it was planned, but if it's like New York or Boston, those are old cart paths that they just paved, and you'll get more organization as you move away from city center, because those areas were like, oh, hey, maybe we should figure this out before we build it. But most of the time, they lack proper planning. And so what you end up with in really, really large cities, this is in China, you have up and out, right? Because you have so many people and you have all of these things in place. And so you really change the features of the earth itself. And so just looking at Las Vegas, which is a place that's in the middle of the desert, you think to yourself, oh my gosh, this really shouldn't sprawl. And yet it does. It's huge. When it started out in the 70s, Las Vegas actually has a really interesting history because the water issue was huge. And until they could figure out how to master getting water to people, it was just this tiny little like outpost in the middle of the desert. No one wanted to live there. And then they figured it out and it was great. And they found there's artesian wells and they're like, "Ooh, we have water. Let's go to Las Vegas." And everybody was like, "Oh, we have water. Let's go to Las Vegas." And then then they got all the casinos and stuff. That's a whole other story. And then it became this huge city, right? And look at how green it is. Look at the green in the middle of the desert. How much has that changed the geography of the region, right? So not only is it sprawl and we're having all the problems of cities, which we will talk about later on, but we're actually changing the ecosystem, right? It's quite amazing. All right, so as cities grow and sprawl outwards, they tend to merge with each other. And the best example in the United States is the Bowash Corridor, which is Boston up here to New York, right? Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and then Richmond's starting to sneak in there too. But you have this big just channel, right? This corridor of all cities. So if you're traveling from DC to Boston, you never leave heavy urban areas. And because there's so much urban area, you can see here we're building up and we're sprawling. You've got so much urban area that it creates a lot of problems. Now, there's some advantages, right? What are the advantages of a city? You've got more job opportunities, better education and health services. You can protect biodiversity because if you do it right, you can actually contain growth, although most people, so there's a little asterisk next to that one, but rarely is that the case. Mostly we just sprawl out and threaten biodiversity. Cities are never self-sustaining. They don't grow their own food, right? They don't deal with their own trash. They usually ship that out. Sometimes some cities are manufacturing cities, but they usually are importing lots of stuff. And so you've got big support systems for the city, and that's a whole nother conversation that we'll talk about a little bit later. They typically lack trees and green spaces. They concentrate pollutants, including noise pollution, and the spread of infectious disease is huge in cities because the population density. The denser the city, the more likely you are to have really big outbreaks of diseases because of the close quarters, right? Disease is a function of population density. And unfortunately, cities become centers of poverty, crime, and terrorism, right? Because if you want to strike terror, you go to places where there are lots of people that will be affected, and that is the city. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of this stuff over the next few class days. But I do want to mention one thing in terms of we're like, oh, we can't change anything. We're too little. Well, there's like 7.5 billion of us. So together, our collective impact is huge. And the first impact that I really want to talk about in detail, besides all the other impacts we just talked about, is the heat island effect. Urban centers actually change the temperature. Cities typically are 2 to 4 degrees hotter than the surrounding areas. And you'll see this mostly in the summer where you've got all of this concrete and you've got this radiation, right? Solar radiation beating down and it's being reflected and absorbed and re-emitted and all of this good stuff. And so you get just hotter temperatures because of concrete buildings. We're also generating heat through air conditioning systems, factories, cars, things like that. And so you'll actually get a change, right? And it looks something like this. And it decreases as you move out into the suburbs until you get out into the wild. Agriculture doesn't do this because it's all plants. So I said it mostly happens in the summers, but it actually also happens in the winter as well. You can see Dallas here is 40 degrees, where Gainesville is 31, right? And in part, there's a little bit of a front coming through, but even Ennis never reads right on this one. I don't ignore that. But Hillsborough is 31, right? So Corsicana is 35. So you can see that there's a clear trend out here. Okay, so why are cities so hot? I just talked about this. This is what I just talked about. Yay! And then here's just an example. When you look at thermal imaging, you can see that here's the photo. Oh, that looks nice. Here's what it looks like in terms of the heat signature. So what can you do about this? Really, the best thing to combat the heat island effect is to have more green spaces, right? And maybe that means turning your buildings into green spaces, building more parks when you can, taking abandoned parking lots and turning them into parks. We're looking at vacant buildings and parking lots for other things, but you can also do this with it, and this is an easy thing to do. Okay, so that is it for this introduction to the problems of urbanization and the changes that occur with urbanization. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for listening. I will see you next time.